Thank you very much, Leah, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting us. So we are going to share this presentation, Forest Disturbances Detection from Ground to Space. I'm having more the ground part, and Anna is going to continue later with the space part. First of all, I would like to briefly introduce the Thünen Institute. We are a federal research institute for rural areas, forestry and fisheries, with several individual institutes, and all institutes do in the three paths research on economy, ecology and technology. Our institute is on the Institute of Forest Ecosystems, and we have four fields of activity. One is the work on forest resources and climate protection. The second one, soil protection and forest health. The third one is forest ecology and biodiversity. That's the one I'm head of. And the fourth is the one on wildlife ecology. We have several statutory assessments, the National Forest Inventory, the Crown Condition Survey, Soil Inventory, and the Intensive Forest Monitoring as part of ICP Forests and the mammal assessments. We are working as well with general techniques on the ground, but more and more with methods from remote sensing. What I'm going to tell you about is the story of the beginning of monitoring in Europe, or better, the UNECE region. And these are pictures from Germany from the 1980s. And at those times, people saw dying forests, especially in the Ore Mountains at the border to the Czech Republic. And they assumed that after the forest, humans will die. And you had stamps, you had posters, people were really worried. And this is why the monitoring started, because people wanted to understand why the forests were dying. And they assumed, as you can see in this picture, that it was down to air pollution, which was very high, especially in those mountainous regions. So what it all started with is the Crown Condition Assessment. Actually, already at the end of the 1970s in Bavaria, people started to realize that at the upper crowns, leaves were missing, that crowns were dying off, that there were damages. And over the years, the whole Crown Condition Assessment developed and is still today one of the most important parts of ICP Forests. And now, of course, we've got handbooks and photo guides, which are normally done for every state, doing the assessment to make the results comparable within the countries, but also across the states. The beginning of monitoring was a political decision at the level of the UNECE. The working group on effects started this discussion, and we had the development of different international programs. It's the ICPs on forests, waters, materials, vegetation, integrated monitoring, modeling and mapping, as well as the Task Force on Health. Because besides the forest dying, people were worried that really the high deposition and air pollution would impact the health of people. So this is what is still, which is still running today. And this is the new logo of ICP Forests. It has moved far from the 1980s, but still the same political situation. And we work under the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution at the 42 countries in Europe and beyond. The mission today has changed slightly, because while we still carry out a multifunctional long-term monitoring of forests within the UNECE region, we now want to provide scientific knowledge on the effects of air pollution, climate change, and other stressors on forest ecosystems. And with this new mission, which is now barely 5 years old, you see that also on the political level, we are moving forward, and people acknowledge that it's not only air pollution, but climate change, which is threatening our forest, and especially the combination of different stresses, which are getting problematic and difficult to understand. This is a map of the level 1 plots. ICP Forests today is working on 2 levels. Level 1 is a systematic grid across Europe, and it's a 16 by 16 kilometer grid. And on each of these points, when they meet forests, the Crown condition assessment is done at an annual basis. Every 15 years, a soil survey happens on the same plots. So the next one is due in 2 years. And every 5 years, nutrients are taken from the Crown. This is not quite the same in all states because, especially with the nutrient analysis, some countries have difficulties funding it. And as you can imagine, with such a big project, funding is always a severe problem. But still, we can see that a lot of countries are submitting the data, and this is the data collected in 2019. And we can see hotspots where we find loss in vitality, especially in France, in parts of Germany and the Czech Republic, but also some spots distributed, for example, in Sweden. So this is quite interesting to see that a lot of forests have still quite a high vitality, shown in green, but others are declining in orange and red and even black dots, where we have mortality. This is supplemented by the level 2 network. The level 2 network are our intensive forest monitoring plots. They are extremely highly equipped. Therefore, we have few level 2 plots, but there are still nearly 700 across the region. And we have 13 different surveys which take place on those level 2 plots. And these are really to understand the response of trees on different stressors. We take meteor data to understand the response to climate, air quality, and deposition. And we look at the response in growth, in the crown, in the ground vegetation, but also in the soil and in the soil solutions. And we look at the changes in, for example, phenology. This is especially important when you're looking at climate, to see how the phenological phases are changing over time and how the leaf area index is changing, as well as the nutrient composition within the crowns. So this data is very comprehensive, and everybody is always encouraged to really apply for the data and do their own analysis. So we want to provide scientific knowledge on the effects of air pollution, climate change, and other stressors on forest ecosystems. And this is really a very important topic, because these pictures are current pictures. They are from the last 3 years, and we see a decline in forest condition, large scale, and we see a lot of individual trees which are dying off or severely stressed. In total, we find over 3 million cubic meters of damaged wood volume in these areas which are marked red. So it's mainly Germany, but also Poland, Switzerland, Austria, Italy, and France. And most of the damage was really in spruce trees. And of course, you all know that spruce is still the bread for most foresters. So this is quite a severe situation now, how we can really keep forestry and wood production alive while still protecting our forests and keeping them stable. In Germany, climate extremes, but also storms, caused an increase in mortality rate. And if you look at this data, which is starting in 1990, you have very low mortality rates over all the years, and for only the last years, basically in 2018, especially spruce mortality rate increased massively. And this is linked, of course, to storms as well, but it is also linked to drought and bark beetle attacks. But other species have an increase as well, especially pine, so our other coniferous tree species in Germany. And especially this combination of dry years, more breeding cycles for insects, the storm damage, but also flooding and forest fires make it very difficult to really know what is happening where and when. So when we look at our forests, we can either look at an individual tree, and we can see that this one was nicely twisted and thrown over by a storm. It looks quite, somehow artistic, I find. And then if we go up with a drone, we can see that the forest damage actually covered a larger area and a lot of trees fell. And if you use remote sensing and go up another scale, we can see tiny little dots of storm damage occurring through the landscape. However, it is always difficult to really know what we actually see on those remote sensing pictures, and therefore we try to really link our ground assessments, which we have from monitoring, to the remote sensing data to really understand what is going on. So one example where we did this, there was an article in Nature Communication now quite some years back, I think it was 2019, which titled "Canopy Mortality Has Doubled in Europe's Temperate Forest Over the Last 3 Decades." So of course we were really interested whether this was true, because we didn't quite see this sharp increase in our data as yet. And therefore we looked at the crown condition assessment and at the mortality rates. And as I showed to you earlier, the mortality rates are somewhere at 0.4%. And if we add all those disturbances together and at the plant utilization, then we actually get a removal and mortality of trees of about 1%. And this we compared with the data from the paper, and actually it matches quite nicely. They reach the 1% threshold basically in the same year as us. However, what they can't tell is what are really the reasons behind this canopy loss, or this decline in canopy density, as I like to call it, because this is what they really measured. And I think it is quite important for us to understand whether we actually had plant utilization or whether we are talking about abiotic and biotic damages. So this is where we can use ground data and really compare it to other surveys. This is from a paper which is just in preparation, and it is showing the mortality rates from the ICP Forest data as well. I think Jan Peter is here in the group as well. And you can see that in 2003, we had individual red dots just distributed across Europe. And we can see an increase of these red dots in 2020. And this is just to show that really this ground data gives us a nice timeline, but it gives us as well an idea about regional hotspots. However, we still need to keep in mind that decline and mortality are a natural process in forest ecosystems. Old forests die due to competition, individual trees die, and this disturbance and the decline are the chance for recovery. Without the old trees dying, the new trees wouldn't be able to establish, and it is a way to really foster adaptation? Other species compositions, younger trees, which are more flexible in their response or better adapted. So for me, it is important to keep in mind that not every dying tree is actually bad news as such. And we need to understand the different disturbances better. And this is really the link now to the remote sensing, because these are the different patterns we find when we look at disturbances. Fire leaves a very distinct mark in the landscape, which is, can be clearly separated from other disturbances due to its color, and normally the headlines as well. Wind is more difficult because it has very small scale damages, as we saw in the pictures before, but it can reach very large scale fellings as well. So this is difficult because it reaches from an individual tree to large scale areas. Insects get even more difficult because they pick their feast. If you have a bark beetle, it is feasting on spruce, and then it is going to eat every spruce it can reach. However, if you've got mixed forest and it's eating only every third spruce tree, it is very hard to really find it using remote sensing. But these are the questions. Anna is now going to show you some examples of how we are trying to separate this.
Thanks for the nice bridge to moving up to space now from the ground, and looking on disturbance in specific right now. I'm going to tell you something about the research idea we had when looking at different patterns from different disturbance events. So the basic question was, how can we use satellite remote sensing to better understand the mechanisms of forest disturbance and, of course, also recovery, which is then the basis for instance, for forest management strategy and planning models to better mitigate through climate change situations in forestry, but also in general in environmental research. So the approach was that we used MODIS Enhanced Vegetation Index time series for change detection on various known disturbed and cracked areas in forest across Germany to build a chronology of disturbance and recovery. Coming from this idea, we had to find a method that is fitting our research questions, or that enables us to find answers to these questions. The basic idea behind it is that we use the vegetation index response from the signal of satellite imagery, what's going on the ground, to see across a timeline. This is, for instance, 1 year, looking at the greenest level of green vegetation or forests on the ground. Basically, there's a normal green up in a normal period, which then is disturbed in this area, and an incline appears also in the signal from the decline in forest canopy greenness on the ground. So we transferred it on this side to the remote sensing methods we wanted to apply to better understand and to also analyze the signals. First, we looked at phenology, which is the expected EVI at particular time steps within the greening season. As you can see above here, the start of defoliation is a kind of a term that also can be met in the theoretical principles behind it, as well as the defoliation event, like the hotspot in time and the refoliation. Coming from this 20-year time series and the phenology from this. We also had a look at the observed EVI at the particular time steps within the greening season of, in this case, 2018, where in the Fleming region insect disturbance and defoliation occurred. And from these two sets of data, we calculated the deviation of the observed EVI from the long-term time series average of the EVI, which we then, like in the further slides, I will relate to this as an anomaly. What you can see from this concept is that the time dimension is very crucial to look at patterns of disturbance. And what I just showed you as a zoomed area from the recent slide, you can find in the eastern part of Germany in Brandenburg, where multiple disturbance events occurred during the year 2019 and 2018. Among these, there were 2 fire occurrences on former military areas with a huge burned area stamp in the end. And we also had insect defoliation in May and July of 2018. Just to give you a more detailed impression what I'm talking about, now we zoom in again on this map. This is the Fleming area I was talking about. And the red areas, the red polygons, show the disturbed areas, whereas the yellow dots are pointing at the center of each MODIS pixel. You remember the satellite image EVI pixel, which we then, and now I'm coming to the workflow, download. So for each of the disturbed areas, we downloaded a sample of 20 MODIS pixels for the last 20 years. We used, in this case, the enhanced vegetation index. Another commonly used vegetation index, which might be more prominent, is the NDVI, so the normalized difference vegetation index. Sorry for this, it's such a used term for me, so that I don't know the long version. And then we went on to stack time series images, or in this case pixels, applied some quality filtering to make it feasible for scientific analysis. And then we, as mentioned earlier, we calculated the phenology from the long-term time series data as kind of a baseline to derive from this the anomaly detected on the actual pixels. Finally, we also extracted the patterns in a spatial and temporal frame. And this is what the following slides are about, just to give you an idea. So we focused in our studies on disturbances, but one interesting insight we got on the first view was that there were different types of disturbances which occurred also in the signal of the satellite response, like the EVI time series response. What you can see on this side is the 20-year long-term time series. So the black line is the averaged EVI value from the 20 pixels, whereas the gray dots in the background are the individual values of these 20 pixels. And the blue box shows actually the time frame, the time window of the disturbance event we're looking at. In the right side, we just imagine we switch these 20 years, we lay all over again to make a stack. This is a time series in the end. And then we can observe the red line is the phenology calculated as the baseline over the long-term time series. And the black dots, which you can see here, are the EVI values of the 20 pixels. And Let me have a look. I guess it was Treuenbrietzen in this case, in 2019, in late July, if I remember correctly, we can see the decline, like a tremendous decline in the EVI values, which mean the greenness of the forest canopy on the ground was gone, and it was wiped out by the fire on the ground. Another, change type we discovered very well and in a very distinct way was gradual change in general, but it was less obvious. The graphs are functioning in the same manner as the graphs above. So we again see the 20 years and the averaged as well as the individual EVI values in the time period of 2018 and during the vegetation index. You can see the individual pixel values here. And here we can see it's less distinct because it has no distinct start. There's no time at which each of the insects are starting to feed the leaves or needles in this case. So the disturbance occurred less distinct in means of the amplitude and the means of the decline, and also the time period where it was evolving was longer than actually the fire patterns from above. Another interesting part was that we had different sample sites where also multi-year and multi-event disturbance patterns have been observable from the Enhanced Vegetation Index time series. So several events, like in this case in the Schorfheide, non-moth was causing defoliation in the pine tree canopies in the first year, whereas at the second year, the trees were attacked by fungi infestation because the vitality was almost down, and then the fungi got a little bit more aggressive. What you cannot see from these pictures, of course, is the climate frame which was occurrent in these years. That's one part that needs to still be researched a little bit more. In the next step, as Tanja also mentioned from the disturbance slide, that disturbance grading in means of severity and magnitude is a quite interesting and hot topic in research right now, defined by abruptness, duration, and intensity. This is quite interesting information, of course, for foresters, but also for each scientist in the ecology field. So what we have been able to do with MODIS data, again, and this is the Fleming region from the very first slides, where insect defoliation occurred, we could spot the hot spots on this forest, predominantly pine tree areas. We could also extract patterns and group them according to their parameters like slope, amplitude, and the time window, of course, which enables us then to have kind of a severity assessment. In the overall overview, pattern intercomparison is also very interesting to look at different pattern types, like from the change types. As mentioned earlier, abrupt and gradual change was one of the very first results we had, but we also can get distinct patterns from the event. Remember, we knew what happened on the ground, but we just found the insights that forest fire and storms both have particular dates where the event occurred. So in this case, the decline in fire was one of the characteristic patterns in more than one cases over Germany. this fire below occurred earlier in the year, and whereas this fire in Trondheim was in late summer. The wind throw, though, was a very difficult pattern to look on. As you can see here, it's quite fuzzy and there's no clear pattern observable only for Kyrill, which was both, sorry, I should have mentioned, both wind throw events occurred in January. That means in winter storms. And the wind-thrown areas in the case of Kyrill were pretty much larger than the ones in the more central part of Germany, but in Friederike nearly 10 years later. Another point that is both very interesting is what you can see here. This fire occurred in pine trees or in pine stands, whereas here it's a little bit more mixed situation with also beech forests in between. So the amplitude of the normal phenology in the EVI is much larger in seasonal, like deciduous trees, or mixed forests as in like pure mono-staged and uni-aged pine forest stands. So on the gradual sides, we have been able to see and spot the very tiny anomalies from the fungi response in the EVI, but in the combination, the two events add up and the signal and the pattern becomes more obvious. I would say it like this. So the main findings from this first study were that we have been able to to apply change detection on various known disturbed areas across Germany. So we also could distinguish between abrupt and gradual change patterns, and we extracted specific spatiotemporal patterns of different kinds of disturbances in the end. No matter what, we also had lessons learned. For instance, that the seasonality effect is one major thing we have to look more into and do further research on it. Another thing is also that the phenology estimation results also vary in values and in the patterns depending on the length of the time series. Imagine you only have 10 years of NDVI or EVI time series data, or 20 years. The more extreme events you also have within this time period, the more or the greater the variety might be and the more fuzzy the data will get. So the anomaly detection really depends on spatial temporal data resolution, which we could also see on very sparse spots of fungi infestation in Bavaria, where we have been able to only guess because we knew from the raw resolution in MODIS data. So just to finalize this, intermediate results and future research is dedicated. First, we had the plot-specific disturbance series. Then we determined some of the parameters, how to distinct between different change patterns, and also determine the magnitude and severity over space and time. And in the next step, we have to hardly look into disturbance interaction and the impact of recovery and resilience to close the circle in the manner of remote sensing supported forestry strategies to face climate change impact and mitigate the consequences. Thanks for listening, and I will give back to Tanja.